Hey, welcome to Weekly Marks, 23 February. Yesterday we did a little memoriam, I suppose, to the Communist Manifesto. Um, we were close to the anniversary of its publishing, so that's why we did it, and in memory of Ruriki, who started this entire series several years ago now. Today we're going to look at Karl Marx Capital Volume 1, Chapter 10, the Princeton edition, 2024, translated and edited by the two Pauls. This chapter is on the concept of relative surplus value. Now, I'm actually happy to do this, particularly since there's a lot of material to cover, possible material to cover anyway. And so to begin this, got lots of charts, and we'll see whether we can display them in a reasonable way. The point, of course, is to talk about the working day. That is, that has a certain amount of value, uh, dividable into necessary and surplus value. There's a difference that Marx makes between absolute and relative surplus value. One is based on extending the working day beyond its 8, 10, 12 hours, referencing obviously the 19th century with longer working days, generally longer working days. Of course, in developing countries, that's more likely the case. And of course, there's always other things, third shift, etc. So absolute and relative surplus value are like this. If you look at the red arrow, and one is adding, the absolute is the add hours to the working day, and relative surplus value is to begin to try and improve, whether it's productivity or some other thing, is to improve the amount of value you're getting out of the work that you're putting in. And that's kind of what it looks like. Production of surplus value is increasing surplus value by extending the working day. You just add those extra hours, and despite time and a half, et cetera, it is actually a surplus value that's being generated. Because you're contracted, of course, for the regular hours from which you normally have surplus value extracted. So Marx's assumption is that if you're going to work longer, um, you're probably going to reach a limit. There is a human limit to doing this, despite drugs and etc. Now, relative surplus value is the length of the working day remaining the same, and increasing surplus value by reducing necessary labor time. So there's a difference between necessary and surplus labor. And one way of reducing necessary labor time is to add things like technology or making people speed up. All kinds of possibilities there. And so when you sort of reconfigure our little arrows and stuff, you can see that the working day remains fixed. There is a necessary labor time and a surplus labor time. And relative surplus value is produced within, and absolute surplus value is produced without. And if you start putting numbers on it, that's the point of this chapter, is to start putting numbers to it, numbers that are intelligible, that are, it's arithmetic. And that makes sort of the capital intelligible to those who would read the Capitalist Manifesto and wonder, why, how is it that I'm being exploited? And what capital does is just simply put numbers to it, numbers that are easy to calculate, no heavy duty math there. And the idea, of course, is to produce surplus. That's what the capitalists want. That's what we most likely might want in terms of defining wealth. But wealth is never really a surplus, is it? I mean, for the so-called average person, people endowed with common sense would think, well, there is surplus, and there are two types of surplus. There's a producer surplus, those people, who own the means of production or at least are managing it. Then consumer surplus, those people who buy commodities, stuff like that. And so there are causes, out of sync supply and demand, uneven or orthodox variation in the price of a commodity, that is sales, clearance, um, overproduction and underproduction, that's a much larger scale activity and problematic for all the usual reasons, because there are lags and, a supply chain, blah, 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 blah. And we're in a crisis of all of these things in the present moment. And you could argue that we're always in that kind of state, but the fact is it's getting worse. And you can pretty much see it. You don't have to make up stuff or try and propagandize people. It's just there. And then, of course, it's revolving around two kinds of things. Of course, transactional costs, which is the cost of management or transfer or, whatever, turnover costs in some ways. And then, of course, taxes, because taxes are necessary. They're a kind of portion of that surplus that is necessary for the common good. I mean, roads, stuff like that. Better air, better water, safe air. And so in the standard, economic approach, you can do price versus quantity, supply versus demand. This is a standard stuff. This is no Marxist ideology or whatever. This is just kind of how neoclassical economics tends to get taught, with an equilibrium point that defines at the market price the difference between consumer surplus and producer surplus. And that's all there. There's this there, it is the way kind of how it works. The problem, of course, and that's what Marx is worrying about, is surplus. How is all of these things sort of accounted for? And that's what I've been, I tend to emphasize. That is, look at your pay stub. Other things are happening. Equilibrium quantity is there, of course, in the vertical axis. Now, consumer surplus denotes the difference between the maximum price consumers are ready to spend on a product and the actual market price they pay. So there is a difference here. There is a difference between the maximum price you're ready to pay as a consumer and then the actual market price. And then there's consumer surplus, and there's always kind of gaps there, you know, and you can argue that taxes take up some of that, whether it's local, state, or federal in the American context. There's all kinds of stuff going on. Um, Similarly, and I want to point this diagram is useful mainly because it kind of defines the circuit argument that we've been looking at. The idea that uh, things are always moving. This is Marx's model. It's a dynamic model in capital. And you can see that fuel efficiency helps labor-saving machines, which increases employment, which creates more fuel consumption. And you can see how all of these things sort of spiral together. I like this particular diagram because it does define the interlocking elements or the nesting of circuits. I've talked before about circuits of capital, and that they kind of sit within each other. And this is part of the bigger kind of system of circulation, as it were. The kind of thing that is the difference between Department 1 and Department 2, and we'll get to Volume 2 again. If you want to see it as a chart, you see it doesn't quite look as ideographic, sort of logical. But in fact, all of these things are features of absolute and relative surplus value. And this is a little table that gives you components of the working day, variation per variable, and the difference between that is absolute surplus value. And if you look across necessary labor, constant variation, the working day varies, and there's constant productivity and constant intensity. That's kind of what makes stuff happen. Note, of course, that surplus labor in that model varies, and the variation would tend to be rises as opposed to falls. And decrease would occur in the relative surplus value element, which has to do with productivity and intensity. Case 1 is productivity, case 2 is intensity. This little table actually combines all of those things that we saw in the little diagram all at once. Now, I even made up my own little table a couple of years ago when I had to still do some of this. It was when I was yakking more, I suppose. So if capitalist labor time can be defined by this particular table, and that is the value of labor power up here, right? Labor power. We're not talking about labor, we're talking about labor power, right? Which combines a lot of things. And time is only one element of it, of course. labor power includes all these other ideas about it as a matter of value. So what Marx wanted to do is to define surplus value in the absolute as, well, there's unpaid labor time, paid labor time in the working day. There's surplus value, that is profits, and then there's wages, which are variable capital, because that's what capitalists is confronted with. I have to now wages tend to be a little bit more inelastic in some ways, that capitalists can't move it around that much, although they do with dual roles or statuses, right? Your intern is not going to make us the same kind of wage usually. So value added has that element, and reproductive labor is the necessary, and we showed that in the other diagram. There's necessary, and then there's surplus labor. And reproductive labor then is, as well as value added and working day in the absolute sense, are added onto the whole business there. So this is a little variation on the same thing that we're talking about above. Now, similarly, in relative surplus value, rather than adding it onto the whole business, it is done from within, where capitalists want to reduce unpaid labor time, for example, to make it either paid labor time or whatever. That's the constraint there. And then profits, of course, against wages, right? And you all do that within the context of the overall labor time. And then finally, surplus labor, you want to increase it relative to necessary labor. So that's all hopefully logical. And you can see all of the terms sort of fall into place. You can talk about value added, you can talk about reproductive labor, you can talk about working day, and you can apply it pretty much to everything. And that's kind of what Marx is trying to do. Now, Section 1, the limits of the working day, has a certain outline. Now, the point is, of course, that this is the redefinition of, or the comparison that can be made among various chapters, right, of different versions. So what we're looking at today is Chapter 10, Concept of Relative Surplus Value. In the first edition, that's what it was called. In the subsequent editions that the editors of the new edition, because the second edition is the one that the Pauls have chosen, is that Chapter 12 is called Relative Surplus Value for what we're going to look at today. And so Chapter 12 remains in the Penguin edition, for example. And so there's a little chart here to get you to sort of remind yourself that they don't all match up. They do sync up, for example, though, for example, Chapter 11, cooperation. Well, not sync up perfectly, but you can say Chapter 13, Chapter 11, etc. And actually, um, the two chapter division, damn it, remains, I think, as we proceed further. So anyway, so that's why there's a reference to Chapter 12 here. The same title, though, the concept of relative surplus value. And this is Ed George's notes, which I think are probably a good summation of what I'm only going to read a couple of paragraphs from. That is Chapter 10, 2024 edition, Karl Marx, Capital, Volume 1. So this is ostensibly the same chapter, although Ed George is talking about Chapter 12 in the Penguin edition. Surplus labor and the value of labor power. So far, we've seen that both the rate of surplus value and the length of the working day are dependent on to what degree the work of the worker is prolonged beyond the time necessary to reproduce her labor power. Given a working day of A to B to C, A to B represents necessary labor and B to C surplus labor. Remember the diagram. If the total length of the working day, for example, A to C, is fixed, would it be possible to increase the time spent in producing surplus value by decreasing A to B? For example, decreasing the time spent in reproducing labor power. On the face of it appear not, at least not without breaking the assumption made so far that all commodities, including labor power, are bought and sold at their full value. So that's the point that Marx is making, is that everything is bought and sold at their full values. This privileges the notion of exchange. This is why Marx differentiates between labor and labor power. He's created a more abstract value that you can sort of manipulate a little bit. If the length of the working day is, say, is fixed as is as well the labor time necessary for the production of labor power or for the reproduction of its value, the magnitude of surplus labor is a residual. The residuals, probably the most popular example of that are residuals in the movie industry, for example, where if you've done a TV program or a film or something, you get residuals from every time it gets shown. That's kind of what it is. Residuals even occur for example, commercials, ads. Given this, a rise in the time spent producing surplus value can only be the result of a fall in the time spent reproducing labor power, and this can come about only through a fall in the value of labor power itself. Now, this in turn can only be achieved through a rise in the productivity of labor, a cheapening of the commodities necessary for labor power's reproduction. And this presupposes a revolution, that is, a set of changes at the level of production. When surplus value has to be produced by the conversion of necessary labor into surplus labor, you're sort of excising more labor out of them so you can get, if you're a capitalist, more profit. It is by no means suffices for capital to take over the labor process in its given or historically transmitted shape, and then to simply prolong its duration. The technical and social conditions of the process, and consequently the mode of production itself, must be revolutionized before the productivity of labor can be increased. In other words, you can bring in a new machine in, you actually have to train people on how to use it, and so there's all kinds of transaction or there production costs. Let's put it that way. Let's just put in the general sense of the idea terms of costs. I mean, if you buy a new machine, you also have to pay for the damn thing. You have to have minions to calculate it, buy it, test it out. But there's all kinds of other costs that are involved. Marx now adopts the following terminology. That surplus value produced by a simple lengthening of the working day he calls absolute surplus value. That arising from the curtailment of necessary labor, relative surplus value. Note that this distinction is not a distinction between different types of surplus value, but between two different ways of producing it. So that's the point of the abstraction, is that there's not these two ideas about surplus value are really only ideas about this larger thing called surplus value, because it is an abstraction. Clearly, the value of labor power will only be lowered if productivity is increased in those branches of industry whose products determine the value of labor power, vis-a-vis products of direct subsistence, or products which form the means of production of products of direct subsistence. That is, stuff that would relate to the amount of value you need to keep yourself alive. Given the nature of capitalist production, the reduction in the value of labor power, the overall sum of all the reductions in necessary labor time in the various branches of industry that enter as components in the value of labor power, is the consequence of a number of independent acts necessarily carried out without joint agreement as to their final effect. In other words, when an individual capitalist cheapens a product through an increase in productivity, she evidently contributes to the overall cheapening of labor power. But this result cannot be her intention. That is, the drive to increase productivity occurs for other reasons. Now, what are all those other reasons? You need a new Lamborghini, whatever. Even if it objectively results in a cheapening of labor power. So people already have these differential motives for doing what they're doing. And so, how it works, individual motives with unintended social consequences, but what other reasons? Now, Marx gives numerical examples, and it can get ugly. And so I included, though, the entire thing, and that you will get lost in my yakking about this, but it's good reading if you read the notes, for example. It's not that hard. First, however, we should note Marx's reluctance to engage in this exercise because he needs to deal with the question of the competition between capitals. The example really lies beyond the level of abstraction of the volume. Well, it's not our intention here to consider the way in which the immanent laws of capitalist production manifest themselves in the external movement of the individual capitals, assert themselves as the coercive laws of competition, and therefore enter into the consciousness of the individual capitalist as the motives which drive him forward. This much is clear. A scientific analysis of competition is possible only if we can grasp the inner nature of capital. just as the apparent motions of the heavenly bodies are intelligible only to someone who is acquainted with their real motions, which are not perceptible to the senses. Now, this is, this sounds cosmological, right? This is Galileo, yeah? Nevertheless, for the understanding of the production of relative surplus value and merely on the basis of the results already achieved, we may add the following remarks. Okay, so in that one note, we can say, okay, abstractions going on. It may seem like only physicists can understand this, but it is reflected easily in these diagrams. Something gets cleaved off between equal rights. Force decides. Hence, it is that in the history of capitalist production, the determination of what is a working day presents itself as a result of a struggle between collective capital, for example, the class of capitalists, and collective labor, i.e., the working class. So the conflict you might have over how much money am I getting out of this, my individual labor, et cetera. And then there's the boss who may not actually be the boss, is just a manager. These are important issues. So I reduce it to that on the one hand. On the other hand, that's kind of what Marx wanted to do with all these numbers. He just wanted to get you to think about this, and that it can be done without a lot of a drama, let's put it that way. So chapter 10 of the 2024 edition of Karl Marx, Capital, Volume 1, translated by the two Pauls, Paul Ryder and Bill North. The concept of relative surplus value. Part of the working day is spent producing an equivalent of the value that capital pays for labor power. Up till now, we've treated that part as a constant magnitude, which in fact it would be under given conditions of production and at a given stage of society's economic development. A worker could be put to work for 2, 4, 6, or more hours beyond the day's necessary labor time. Both the rate of surplus value and the total length of the working day were determined by how far his labor time was extended past it. The necessary labor time was constant, but the total working day was variable. Now let's imagine a working day where both the total length of the day and the division between the necessary labor time and the surplus labor time are given. So let's also say that the line A to C, that is A dash B dash C, represents a working day of 12 hours. The segment AB represents 10 hours of necessary labor. The segment B to C stands for 2 hours of surplus labor. How can additional surplus labor be produced? In other words, how can the surplus labor be prolonged without extending AC any further or irrespective of its extension? The working day's limits may be fixed, but it still seems possible to lengthen the segment B to C. If not by extending it past its endpoint C, which is also the end of the workday AC, then by moving its starting point B in the opposite direction, or back towards A. Suppose the segment B prime to B in A dash B prime to B to C is equal to half the length of the segment BC, or 1 hour of labor. And this is asking you to imagine a lot, I suppose, a lot easier in paper, I suppose. If B is moved back to B prime in the workday AC, then the segment BC will become B prime C, and the surplus labor will increase by half from 2 hours to 3, even although the total length of the workday will be 12 hours, just as before. Clearly, it's impossible to turn BC into B prime C, or 2 hours of surplus labor into 3, without also compressing the necessary labor time. That means, work harder, faster, whatever, better. Thus, AB becomes AB prime, 10 hours of necessary labor becomes 9. The extension of the surplus labor corresponds to the reduction of the necessary labor. Part of the labor time the worker often expended for his own sake is turned into labor time. He expends for the capitalist's benefit. Now, what changes isn't how long the workday is, but how it is divided into necessary labor and surplus labor. And so all those diagrams that I just showed you, really, that's kind of what it means. And it gets more confusing once we start adding numbers. That is, the current value, you can imagine the 19th century value of a shilling is a lot different. than dollars or pounds or, you know, whatever cents are. So, without burdening you with this, and those who have access to this page can read the entire thing here. It's actually not that long. I could have read it all, but then I would have probably lost you somewhere before the end. So let me read the last two paragraphs that, because all of those little numbers of shillings and pence, et cetera, are going to confuse you. But you can read it for yourself. Please do. A commodity's absolute value isn't in itself of any interest to the capitalist who produces the commodity. All that interests him is the surplus value embedded in his commodity, the surplus value that he can realize upon selling it. When the surplus value is realized, the value that was advanced is, of course, replaced. And because relative surplus value increases in direct proportion to the growth of labor's productive power, while the value of commodities falls proportionally as that same growth occurs, or in other words, because one and the same process simultaneously makes commodities less expensive and enlarges the amount of surplus value that they contain, we can now solve the following riddle. Now, given that the capitalist cares only about producing exchange value, why is he constantly trying to lower the exchange value of his commodities? Now, one of the founders of political economy, Dr. Kane, used this contradiction to torment his rivals, who were never able to offer an example. Quote, you acknowledge, he says, that the more one can reduce the expenses and costs of labor in the manufacture of industrial products without injury to production, the more advantageous is that reduction because it diminishes the price of the finished article. And yet you believe that the production of wealth, which arises from the labor of the craftsmen, the artisans, consists in the augmentation of the exchange value of their products. So there's a kind of contradictory thing, and that's the reason why Marx spends all his time comparing rates, is that's perhaps an easier way to talk about this. And of course, this implies that there's something going on here in terms of rate, which refers partially to the idea of calculus, which also refers to a kind of marginal analysis. And I sort of showed you that in the difference between consumer surplus and producer surplus. Under capitalist production, then, the point of achieving greater economy of labor by increasing labor's productive power isn't to shorten the workday. Capitalist production wants only to shorten the labor time required to produce a certain quantity of commodities. When enhanced productive power enables a worker to make a commodity 10 times faster than he used to, a capitalist is hardly prevented from having him work 12-hour days, just as before, from having him produce 1,200 units instead of 120. In fact, the worker's workday might even be extended. He might now have to produce 1,400 units in 14 hours. Hence, in the writings of economists of McCulloch's ilk, such as Ura, Senior, and tutti quanti, we read that workers owe capital a debt of gratitude for developing their productive powers, since this reduces their necessary labor time. But then we also read that to show how grateful they are, workers actually have to produce 15 hours of labor rather than 10. Under capitalist production, the purpose of developing labor's productive power is to compress the part of the workday when a worker has to work for himself and thereby enlarge the part when he can work for the capitalist for free. To what extent can this be done without lowering the value of commodities? We'll see then that when we examine the particular methods that are used to produce relative surplus value, let us turn to them now and on to the next chapter. And so the notes have, these are Marxist notes, of course, and are discussions about, stuff on the basic political economy of the matter. And the editor's notes only include pro tanto and tutti quanti. And as I said, where we'll go next week is chapter 11, cooperation, which is the equivalent of chapter 13 in other editions, more recent than the second edition from which the translation is made. And you'll see that there's, we're following generally in order. The week after that will be chapter 12, the division of labor in the manufacturing system. There will be discussion of technology, machines, etc. And, that's the bigger deal in the 19th century. the equivalent to the current problem, and one which has problematic elements, of course, questions of, well, where is labor in artificial intelligence? Well, there's a lot of new research on this, addressing this particular kind of question, and it, of course, overlaps with the issue of financialization, a variety of other things that talk about problems of cognitive capital. And when you think, you're actually doing, your brain is pumping blood and doing something. So, and most of your stuff is, even in the most primitive of minds, a cognitive one, if you really want to get down to it. Anyway, so I've included this set of notations, that is the 2024 translation of Chapter 10, the version of chapter of its equivalent, Chapter 12, from the Penguin edition by Ed George, all the necessary notes, plus the math. If you're really excited about the math, it actually works. It's a little tedious, but it kind of works, which it's arithmetic, but it is an arithmetic that would be accessible to the average worker who, having been revved up by the manifesto, decides, well, how is this really happening? Are there real facts involved? And he goes through the math, and this is what capital's for, is to sort of say, as a kind of empirical proof of this, here's how you're being exploited. And this is the money equivalent. And of course, the money equivalent is a problematic element in and of itself, which is why money wasn't covered until much later in Marx's writing. He just put it off to later. He was going to get to it. I mean, I think he would have gotten to it. Certainly, Engels was aware of that. And then ultimately in post-war, that is post-World War II, people started looking at this a little more closely, and that's kind of where we get modern money theory, although it has its other issues. But the fact that we're on to modern money theory now at least is a some acknowledgement that there are other elements that go on in the analysis that are part of the sort of differences among orthodox economics and heterodox economics. Heterodox economics says, well, there's these other things, that it's not like they don't exist. You just assumed them out of out of exist. You can't assume them out of existence because they exist in reality. So you have to sort of always confront it with reality, and that's what the facts of this are, and why we still go back and read Marx, because it's kind of easy. You go, oh, okay, this is how long I have to work during the day. Here's how much work I actually put into it. Here's something where I can at least use some of the surplus value for my own purposes. And the problem is there's always a limit to human endurance, etc. And then there's sleep. I included, and I did mention this to identify the last section here, which is from Harry Cleaver's notes for Capital, Volume 1. They are, of course, the limits of the working day chapter, and This is Harry Cleaver's outline, which is many years old, but still right there. LP refers to labor power. M, in this particular case, is means of production, as in MP, LP, in that sort of standard algebra. So you recognize that there are links to all those. They're not links to the diagrams, but if you need to find them, you can use an image search. Pretty much everything is available as it is. And I've left a little time for discussion. Let's see if we have some comments in the chat. Uh, yes, you keep hearing surplus value as circus value. It is a bit of a circus. Or if you want to think of the sort of the retconning, that is the revisionist history of the Village People, a group from the 1980s, I guess it's the 1980s or 70s even, by Donald Trump. If the Village People are still with us, then they must have a village idiot, and I think who I'm referring to. So there's that. Let me proceed back, because in our trajectory at 5 o'clock, in just an hour and a couple minutes, we will have Star Trek. And I don't know if John's here to talk about that. You don't have to, John. I will stop share and move